Hi Rod, welcome back to 10 by 6.
Thanks very much for having me on again.
This is a particular session that we've been waiting a while to put together and to present, because I think the nature of war, and the focus is on Ukraine this week and telling the realities of Ukraine, which I think many people aren't aware of. But I think it's been going on now, 3 months officially, ish, and we've had time to really investigate this topic and to identify from some very credible sources the realities. So I think it's about time that the public at large perhaps were presented with the realities. So over to you, Rod.
Okay, thanks very much for that introduction. Okay, so anything where you're talking about a sort of ongoing war is always done with the caveat that it's always really difficult to get perfect information on what's going on. So there's always a degree of uncertainty, but I'll try and sort of make that clear where that's part of what I'm talking about. So it's also important to understand that I am anti-war. I'm not in favor of war. So what we're doing here is really trying to help people understand why this is happening, because the mainstream press gives this very kind of comic book, Russians are the bad guys, like Putin's the devil, and you know, that's the situation. But in fact, it's much more complex than that, and you have to have history and you have to have context, and then suddenly you get an entirely different picture. So if we begin in approximately 2014, where there was a coup in Ukraine, which was backed by the Americans, and we actually have leaked documents showing the role of the Americans in engineering this coup, where a Russian-backed leader in Ukraine was replaced with an American-backed leader in Ukraine, and there have been serious problems in Ukraine since then. So at the time of the coup, there were protests against the existing leadership, and some of the protests started off as just ordinary people who didn't like the government, but quite rapidly those protests were sort of hijacked by violent extremists, some of whom would probably deserve the label Nazi, although I don't want to get bogged down in debates about definitions and so on. But those people are extremists and they've committed many atrocities. Now, the current leader, Zelensky, is an American-backed leader. So to understand what's going on, there are two sets of issues which are all interconnected. One set of issues is about the role of Ukraine internationally, and the other set of issues is about what's happening within Ukraine. So if we start looking at what's going on within Ukraine, so Ukraine is really a patchwork of regions. And although this is oversimplifying somewhat, it's fair to say that in the west of Ukraine, most people would predominantly be pro-European, whereas in the east of Ukraine, most people would predominantly be pro-Russian. So there's a part of eastern Ukraine, which is known as the Donbas region. So that's not what's called the basin around two towns, Donetsk and Luhansk. And those are very much Russian-speaking areas. Well, when the new government came into power in 2014, it introduced laws where it banned Russian-speaking, banned the Russian language and lots of other sort of languages like that. Well, the people of that region didn't like that. And that led to ultimately a civil war, but primarily it's people, the Ukrainian military and the extremists attacking the people of the Donbas region. And there's an organization which is about as independent as you can get in these situations called the OSCE. That's the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. And they've documented approximately 15,000 deaths in that fighting, most of them people of the Donbas region. Now, it's important to note that in February earlier this year, just a couple of months ago, they noted a massive increase in the shelling of the Donbas region. And that would normally be something that preceded a very large-scale attack. So it was immediately after that increase in shelling that Russia recognized the two towns, Donetsk and Luhansk, or those two regions, as two separate states, so separate from Ukraine, and then went in to protect the people in that region from a possible attack. Now, there's a second part of Ukraine that's worth understanding, and that's the Crimea. Now, that is the place which contains Russia's only warm water port. So that is important militarily. And in 2014, there was a referendum there where the people voted to leave Ukraine and to become part of Russia. And in March 2021, so just over a year ago, the Ukrainian leader Zelensky said, we are taking back Crimea. And in the following year, put lots and lots of soldiers in the south and east of Ukraine. And so Russia is very worried that they could lose Ukraine. So Russia wants peace agreements where Ukraine has no claim on Crimea. Okay, so that's the sort of domestic situation in Ukraine. And then there's the international situation. And mostly this relates to an international organization called NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which was set up in 1949. Now, its original purpose was defensive, so to protect European countries against what at the time was called the Soviet Union. But actually in more recent years, since the Soviet Union disintegrated in 1989, it's no longer been a defensive organization. It's very aggressively participated in the destruction of Yugoslavia and the destruction of Libya and so on. So it's not a defensive organization anymore. Now, after the Berlin Wall came down in 1989 and the Soviet Union collapsed, there was a verbal agreement that NATO would not expand eastwards towards Russia. But in fact, many countries have joined NATO, and Russia is very worried that if Ukraine becomes a member of NATO, that America will put nuclear missiles in Ukraine pointing at Russia. That's very close to Russian cities. And so they would have no way to defend themselves against those missiles if the Americans were to use them to attack Russia. Now, there's a debate about whether Ukraine is already a member of NATO or not. So legally, it is not a member of NATO. But in practice, if you look at the way American soldiers and NATO soldiers have been there training Ukrainian soldiers in ways where they could fit in immediately with NATO and they know how to use NATO weapons, they are in practice acting as members of NATO. And in fact, America has not just supplied lots of weapons, lots of training, lots of expertise and so on, but they've also built biological weapons research labs in Ukraine. And in fact, one independent reporter, a lady called Lara Logan, noted that it was the biological weapons research labs in Ukraine that was the first place where the Russians went when they invaded. So as far as Russia was concerned, they were a danger. And so that's where they went immediately. So Russia doesn't want nuclear missiles in Ukraine, and it wants Ukraine to be neutral. That means not a part of NATO. Okay, so that's the kind of background to what's going on. So there's been quite a lot of fighting for the last couple of months, but what we see in the newspapers and on television in Britain, and the same will be true in America, is a great deal of propaganda. Now, we know this for sure. There's people who've documented that the Ukrainian government have hired PR companies, and there are American PR companies who are lobbying lobbying American policymakers to send more weapons and to escalate the war and so on. Now, it's almost certainly the case that the Russians will be doing their own propaganda as well. But it's important to understand that we in the West, we in Britain and America, are on the receiving end mostly of Ukrainian and American propaganda. Yeah. So there have been a number of atrocities that have been covered on television and in the media. So there was a theatre in Mariupol where there was an attack. There was a massacre in another town called Bucha, and there was an attack on a hospital. But the evidence and the eyewitness reporting with all of those things suggests they are much more likely to have been carried out by the Ukrainians than by the Russians. Now, we can't be 100% certain of this, but it does seem that a strategy of the Ukrainians is to do what's called false flag attacks. And that's where they commit an atrocity, but then try to blame it on the Russians. And so the propaganda about these atrocities, to me, reminds me of what happened in 2003, where there was a huge amount of propaganda trying to persuade everybody that Iraqi soldiers were killing babies in incubators in Kuwait. And that was to try to get the Americans involved in the war against the Iraqis. But it turned out the whole thing was made up by a public relations company using some senior member of the Kuwaiti royal family as their main witness. So entirely false. So it seems quite likely that many of these atrocities that are being discussed in the Western media may well not be carried out by the Russians. But what we do know for sure is that there are some atrocities being carried out by the Ukrainian extremists. So they've been stopping people leaving the cities because that makes it much more difficult for the Russians to attack. And we've even had eyewitness reports saying that they are leaving landmines to try to stop people leaving the cities. So really quite brutal actions. And in fact, Russia has now presented evidence to the European Court of Human Rights about the Ukrainian extremists murdering and torturing prisoners. And we've even seen evidence that critics of the Ukrainian government and people who would like to have peaceful negotiations with the Russians, they have also been murdered. So there have been some leaks from the US Department of Defense which have admitted that actually Russia is being careful about civilian casualties and about too much property damage. So this is a much, I hesitate to use the word gentle in wartime, but this is a much less aggressive assault than the sort of thing that Britain and America did on Iraq when they did shock and awe and just fired thousands and thousands of missiles, slaughtering huge numbers of people indiscriminately. So if we look at the big picture, it's important to understand sort of what's going on around the world, what America wants, and so on. So the Americans wanted this attack to happen. They've actually been doing things, and we'll look at that in a little bit more detail, to try to force Russia to attack. So it's important to understand that some of the things we've talked about in previous weeks about America and Britain, they have committed the worst crimes of the 21st century in destroying Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Syria, and with a bit of assistance from the Saudis, also destroying Yemen. But America has also carried out many overthrows of other governments, often using the phrase color revolution to pretend it's a peaceful protest by the people, when in fact it's America trying to engineer fairly violent revolutions. And it's also important to understand the really big picture that America dominates the global economy and China and Russia are actively trying to change that. So they want an end to the domination of the US dollar as the world's, it's called the reserve currency, so it's the most important currency. At the moment, America pretty much has control of the organizations, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and the World Trade Organization. So it wants that control to end. And they also want to come up with an alternative payments mechanism. So again, America controls the international payments system, which is called SWIFT. And again, China and Russia want to end that. So they're trying to move towards a world which is not dominated entirely by America, where America controls everything. America, on the other hand, wants the system to continue. And what it particularly wants at the moment is to try to weaken links between Russia and its European neighbors. So it's trying to create conflict between Russia and its neighbors. And in particular, America doesn't want Germany and Russia to have close links. And in fact, they built a pipeline between Germany and Russia called Nord Stream 2 to bring Russian gas to Europe, and the Americans really don't like that. So by provoking an attack, by provoking the Russians into attacking Ukraine, it gives the impression that actually Russia is this great big threat, a great big threat to all of Europe. And so more countries will join NATO, the international organization that we talked about at the beginning. So countries like Finland are now talking about whether to join NATO, but it means all NATO members will want to take on board more and more weapons. So in fact, there's been a think tank called RAND. It's an American think tank which did a study in 2019 about how to get Russia to attack Ukraine. what can you do to provoke it? And they recommended military exercises in Ukraine and the Black Sea, withdrawing from weapons treaties and putting offensive weapons in Ukraine. Well, America has done all of these things. So the evidence very clearly does suggest that the Americans wanted this war. They've gone out of their way to ensure that it will happen. Now, it's important to see this thing from the point of view of the Russians, and in particular, a little bit of history is worth noting. So in the 1990s, after the Soviet Union collapsed, various economic advisors from America and Britain and other Western countries went to Russia to try to change their economy. And one of them has even admitted that actually he realized years later that the goal was not to improve their economy. It was actually a continuation of the Cold War. Cold War is to destroy the Russian economy. And in fact, the policies that were implemented in that period had terrible consequences for Russia. So their output dropped by about half, about 70 million people dropped into poverty, and life expectancy increased by a huge amount. In fact, life expectancy decreased, by an amount that you would only see normally in wartime. So it really did drop. So the Russians are really afraid that the American long-term goal is to overthrow the Russian government and impose those economic policies all over again. So they have reason to be afraid of outsiders trying to overthrow their government. Now, in terms of trying to position what Russia is doing in Ukraine in the sort of long-term historical analysis of invasions, it's important to understand there is a concept these days which is called responsibility to protect. Now, normally this is abused by Britain and America, where they say, hey, we have to go and attack this country in order to protect people. Now, so far, they've never actually protected anyone as far as we can see. But before responsibility to protect actually existed in any meaningful sense at the United Nations, if you go back to 1978, some older viewers will remember that Cambodia was governed by a dictatorship run by a man called Pol Pot, and the government was called the Khmer Rouge, and they committed one of the worst genocides in all of human history. Well, the neighboring country, Vietnam, was worried that the violence in Cambodia was spilling over into Vietnam. And so Vietnam actually invaded Cambodia and ended the genocide. So there is at least one example of where invading a neighboring country is probably the least worst option. Now, I would have said from everything that I've seen that what Russia is doing in Ukraine is much, much closer to that Vietnam-Cambodia situation than anything else that we might have analyzed, such as America destroying Iraq and so on. So in terms of how we sort of go forward from this situation, it's really important that nobody tries to make the situation worse. So we've heard lots and lots of commentators, not just in the media, but actually you see it in people having discussions in unions and on Twitter saying, hey, we've got to send weapons, or hey, we've got to declare a no-fly zone. But actually, all of those things would simply increase the scale of the violence. In fact, what we need is to decrease the violence as much as possible, get everyone sitting around a negotiating table as soon as possible to come up with an agreement which keeps everybody safe in the long term. But the Americans particularly, but also other NATO members, clearly don't want to have a safe negotiation in the near future. So we have evidence that America is training terrorists in a number of countries, particularly in Syria, and then sending them to Ukraine. We have other evidence that Britain is training military forces in Poland and sending them to Ukraine. So there's more and more eyewitness reporting coming out from independent journalists saying that some NATO members, and particularly the US, want the war to continue in order to weaken Russia. And America particularly is going out of its way to block peaceful outcomes. And in fact, on some of the previous presentations that I've given about other wars, I mentioned that actually there were also occasions where we could have had peaceful negotiations in relation to those other wars. So this would be Yugoslavia and Libya most notably, but also the British attack on the Falklands after the Argentinians had invaded back in 1982. There were lots of opportunities to have peace negotiations which might have solved things, and it's the Americans particularly, or in the case of the Falklands, it was Maggie Thatcher particularly, who didn't want to have peace negotiations. Okay, so there's just been a couple of things happening in the last couple of days where, once again, it's important to understand that there might be some uncertainty about the information that's coming out. But there's a French journalist who said very clearly that it's the Americans who are in charge of this war, and other eyewitnesses saying actually there are SAS units and US special forces operating in Ukraine. And so these people are going out of their way to make sure that the war carries on as long as they can get it to carry on. So that's the situation at the moment. So I think that's probably quite a good time to wrap up and leave it there unless anyone has any big questions.
Thank you so much, Rod. And I think it's so important just to cover the evidence and the facts to allow the reader to have a completely different perspective. There are actually just a few little points I just wanted to bring to the surface.
Sure.
Firstly, if the Ukrainians are orchestrating the atrocities within Ukraine and it isn't the Russians, that therefore suggests that these atrocities are being dealt out on their own people.
Indeed, that is very much the case. And we have eyewitnesses saying that the extremists really don't like the Russian-speaking people in Ukraine. They treat them as entirely sort of separate. They don't think of them as their own people at all. And this is where the discussions about Nazism have come from, that actually they would be quite happy with ethnic cleansing within Ukraine and things like that. So yes, they're quite happy to harm their own people.
Do you think there's an argument then as a solution? And I know everything that you've talked about and discussed in the last 20 minutes or so suggests that the US, the UK, the Western part of it, they don't want solutions at this point. It doesn't suit their needs, which we'll touch on in a sec. But just listening to what you're saying there, it reminds me a little bit about Czechoslovakia and being split up into the Czech Republic and Slovakia. Isn't there an argument at some point to argue then that those in the East to have their own state, perhaps if the Russians will recognize it, and those in the West to have their own state, which will be recognized by the non-Russian speaking Ukrainian people, to have two separate governments? Is that a feasible option?
So I think it is a feasible option. And as far as Russia is concerned, they have recognized the two states in the Donbass region as independent. Now, that isn't yet the case at the United Nations. It hasn't been recognized by anybody else and so on. So we'll have to see how that develops. And in fact, there were negotiations in 2014 and 2015 about what would happen with those two states. And for most of the period up until very recently, the Russians didn't want them to be completely independent. They wanted them to be what's called autonomous. So they would still be part of Ukraine, but they would have the right to speak their own language and make all sorts of rules that related to themselves and so on. But the Ukrainians didn't want that. And in fact, again, for this whole period, Russia have been trying to have conversations about, what's the long-term future of the different parts of Ukraine going to be, and what's the long-term future of Ukraine going to be relative to NATO and other international countries. From approximately 2014 until about 2022, the Russians have been very calm, taken things very peacefully, and just waited and waited. But nobody else seems keen on coming up with a peaceful solution. So even the French and the Germans have participated in these negotiations, but they've never put any pressure on the Ukrainian leadership to implement the ideas that have been discussed. So there is a real unwillingness to come up with a meaningful long-term solution.
Right. Okay, thank you. Is there an argument also that we should refrain from using words like Ukraine, Russia, America, Britain, because ultimately these decisions aren't being made by the populations of any of those countries. They're just being made by a small clique of powerful, wealthy people who have their own agenda. Should we move away from saying Russia this and Russia that and focus much more on those people in power who are responsible?
Well, I think that's a really good point. And, you know, I kind of flipped backwards and forwards on this when I was writing the sort of version of this presentation, that you're absolutely correct. We should be more specific about who's making the decisions. And it's a convenient shorthand to say Russia
Yes.
wants this and Ukraine wants this, but you're absolutely right. It is very small numbers of very powerful people in each country who make these decisions. And so we should be saying, you know, the Ukrainian leadership or Zelensky's group of decision makers and so on. Perhaps I'll be more precise in future.
In terms of your comparison to Vietnam, it very much also reflects that the Vietnamese at that point, as a nation state, were persona non grata for the US because of obviously the war that the US had just been defeated in with Vietnam. So when Vietnam invaded Cambodia in order to liberate the people, especially along the border, liberate the people from the Khmer Rouge, the US straight away went in there and was very critical of Vietnam, but purely because of those political machinations related to defeat in war. And therefore the Americans effectively allowed the Khmer Rouge to last a lot longer than they would have done if they just allowed the Vietnamese to go in there and get rid.
So I haven't studied that era in enough detail to sort of speak authoritatively on it. I was really surprised when I did the research initially to discover that actually Britain and America had initially supported the Khmer Rouge, even when they knew they were a very violent, ruthless government. And in fact, we've seen many other examples in these presentations where America and Britain do actively support some of the most brutal mass murdering dictators. And so we start to realize, of course, that human rights is not really an important point of British and American foreign policy.
John Pilger evidences that the CIA went into the forest in Cambodia and helped to retrain the Khmer Rouge so that they could fight back against the Vietnamese.
Oh, did they? I wasn't aware of that. So, well, that's really interesting. I shall have to dig out John Pilger's writings from that period and get some more detail on. But that doesn't surprise me. That would be consistent with what US policy is. And there's a point that I want to mention that's worth kind of linking into that. We see lots of people that I've mentioned saying, hey, let's have a no-fly zone, let's have weapon supplies going to the Ukrainians. And when people do that, and this includes people from the anti-war movement, when people do that without being aware of it, they're completely kind of ignoring all the evidence they've seen from the last, 75 years of the fact that Britain and America do not have good intentions in their foreign policy. They don't care how many people die in other countries. They really don't care about people in Ukraine. You know, they're not there to go and help the people of Ukraine. They're only there to try and do things that might weaken Russia. So it's always important to bear in mind that if you actually start saying, hey, we need a no-fly zone, which would probably mean American anti-aircraft missiles and American aeroplanes in the war zone, actually you're helping the American empire reinforce its power. And so it's important we don't do anything that might have that effect, because they are ultimately the biggest criminal organization in the world.
Yeah, and John Pilger writes about in his book Hidden Agendas, and it's obviously called Hidden Agendas for a very good reason, ultimately because the agendas aren't ever presented to us in public forums, whether it be the corporate media, the mainstream media, etc. It's very much left in the darkness because they're the actual driving force of what goes on. But he very much talks about the fact that and you refer to it being about putting the Russians in their place and gerrymandering the world to benefit the US and their allies. Well, in actual fact, a lot of it is also about the armed industries and the share values and the portfolio investments of a very small group of people who get even more wealthier as a direct result of getting people to say sell arms or give arms to the Ukrainians to allow them to fight back. It's a propaganda, it's a manipulation, it's a conditioning of populations so that they end up conforming to the hidden agenda without knowing that it's a hidden agenda.
Absolutely. I think that was a very good sort of description of what's going on, that even the most well-intentioned people can be manipulated by propaganda to get them to fall in behind the wrong set of sort of actors in international affairs.
Yeah, and just to finish off with the Falklands, ultimately also because of the election cycles that exist within countries, and countries that we call democracies. In actual fact, as we saw with Margaret Thatcher in 1981, she was polling horrifically low from a Conservative standpoint. She was officially the most unpopular prime minister in British history since they'd started recording populist data. And all the people who were whispering in her ear were saying, your standing in the polls is not going to improve if you come up with a peaceful solution, because the people won't care about that. What the people want to see is the UK sending out armed forces to Falklands, taking the Falklands back, and let us do all the propaganda about, you know, the Gualtieri and what they represent and you know, their criminal backgrounds and activities. We'll paint a lovely picture for the public. Well, you go and reclaim it, and you go and stand in front of the cameras and come up with quotations and assertiveness that, you know, nationalists and the patriots will glory in. So it wasn't about finding a peaceful solution then, I don't think, and it isn't about finding a peaceful solution now. It's a political tool that's often used, and a lot of people are also asking on the back of COVID, why this timing? Is it because they want to put COVID back in the box, and the only way they can put them back in the box is by swamping the media with something else, i.e. big bad Russians?
Well, that's a good question. So just to go back on the first point you were talking about the Falklands and Margaret Thatcher and so on. So I always think it's slightly ironic that I did some research years ago which suggested actually that the dictatorship in Argentina that did the invasion of the Falklands initially were extremely unpopular. I mean, they were a dictatorship, so they were bound to be unpopular, but it had got to the point where actually, you know, they couldn't survive much longer. And so they believed that a war would be useful to them. And you've got Margaret Thatcher thinking that a war is useful to her. So you've got two sets of insane sociopathic leaders all doing insane things just because they're looking for electoral support. And unfortunately, that does seem to play a massive role in the thinking of many rather too powerful and too influential people. And, you know, I just keep hoping that more and more people will wake up to what really goes on and start thinking about how we can change the system. So, you know, the idea of having wars to gain political support is no longer something that people really want to do, that we actually start thinking seriously about how we actually make the world a better place. But still got a long way to go yet.
And that's a fabulous message to finish on. Thank you so much, Rod. Again, the clarity backed up by valid sources. It's now up to the public to take this information and move forward. Thank you so much.
Thank you.